grand hall of the Westbridge Art Auction glowed with chandeliers and arrogance. The room smelled of polished wood, old money, and champagne that cost more than some people's rent. Laughter bounced off the marble walls, smooth and rehearsed, the kind that belonged to people who had never known hunger or humiliation. Outside, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. A valet opened the door hesitantly, not because of who he saw, but because of what she wasn't. The woman who stepped out wore a simple cream-colored dress, modest heels, and no jewelry except for a silver bracelet that caught the light like a quiet secret. Her hair was tied back, her makeup minimal. She didn't look like the crowd inside. No designer label flashing on her handbag, no assistant trailing behind her. Her name was Amara Blake, and tonight, she was about to teach the room what value really meant. When she walked into the lobby, the receptionist barely looked up. "Are you lost, ma'am? The staff entrance is on the side." Amara blinked, slightly startled but calm. "No, I'm here for the auction." The woman behind the counter frowned. "The auction is for invited guests only." "I know," Amara said, showing her invitation. Embossed, official, flawless. The receptionist's fake smile faltered, then returned quickly. "Of course. My apologies, Ms. Blake." She scanned the list. "Right. Table 14. Please enjoy the evening." Her tone carried that brittle politeness that only the truly condescending could master. As Amara walked past, two women whispered loudly behind her. Did she really just walk in here dressed like that? Probably a last-minute guest. Maybe an assistant to one of the bidders. Amara heard them. She didn't flinch. She'd heard worse, and from people far richer. Inside, the auction hall was breathtaking. Gold-trimmed frames lined the walls, displaying priceless art. Monet, Rembrandt, and a few modern pieces that screamed more ego than talent. Wealth filled every seat. Waiters glided through the aisles with trays of champagne and canapes that looked more like sculptures than food. Amara found her seat quietly. She sat alone. To her left, a man in an Italian suit leaned toward his friend and smirked. "Wrong room, maybe? Thought this was an art auction, not a charity dinner." His friend chuckled. "Who knows? Maybe she's just here to watch us play." The auctioneer, a tall man with slicked-back hair and a voice made for theater, tapped his gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the annual Westbridge auction. Tonight, we open with the Garden of Stillness, a 19th-century landscape. Starting bid, $40,000. Paddles shot up instantly. The air thickened with competitive greed. Amara watched silently, hands folded in her lap. The man beside her raised his paddle, then gave her a sideways glance. "You should try it," he said mockingly. "You might win yourself a nice wall decoration for your apartment." She smiled faintly. "I'll wait for something that speaks to me," he scoffed. At these prices, the art better scream. The room buzzed with money, people bidding not because they loved the paintings, but because they loved being seen bidding. By the time the fourth item was sold, the total had already crossed $500,000. Then the fifth item appeared on stage, The Widow's Garden, a haunting piece painted by a lesser-known black artist from the early 1900s. It wasn't the most famous work in the room, but there was something about it. The grief in the brushstrokes, the strength in the silence. Amara's eyes softened. The auctioneer began. Starting bid, $25,000. For a moment, no one spoke. The elite crowd hesitated. The artist's name didn't carry the same prestige as the others. A few whispered to each other, uninterested. Then Amara raised her paddle. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Heads turned. The man beside her smirked. "Feeling bold now, are we?" The auctioneer smiled politely. "We have $25,000. Any higher?" Another paddle lifted. 30. Amara raised hers again. 40. Gasped. The whispers grew. Does she even have that kind of money? Someone should tell her this isn't a thrift shop. The man beside her laughed. Sweetheart, you might want to slow down. You're bidding against people who own private jets. Amara didn't even look at him. Then they can afford to lose. The auctioneer's eyes flickered with amusement. Going once, going twice sold. To Ms. Amara Blake. The gavel struck, and the murmurs swelled. As the attendants prepared the next piece, the man beside her leaned in. You just spent 40 grand on a painting no one's heard of. Amara's calm voice held an edge of quiet power. That painting was by Lillian Hart, the first black woman to ever showcase her art in this city. She died without ever being paid for it. The man blinked, momentarily silenced. Amara looked back toward the stage, her expression unreadable. I didn't buy it for status, she said softly. I bought it for justice. The man opened his mouth, but no words came out. And for the first time that night, the arrogance around her began to crack, just slightly, as whispers shifted from laughter to curiosity. No one knew it yet, but Amara Blake wasn't just here to buy art. She was here to own the room. The whispers didn't fade as the next paintings rolled in. They multiplied. Every time Amara lifted her paddle, a murmur rippled through the crowd. It wasn't just the audacity of her bids. It was the way she bid, calm, confident, and unbothered, as though she had already decided the outcome before anyone else had even raised their hand. By the seventh item, she had already purchased 2 more paintings, a forgotten abstract by a Mexican immigrant artist, and a self-portrait by a woman the catalogs described as unmarketable. The room didn't know what to make of her. The auctioneer, polished and poised, hid his surprise behind a practiced smile. We have quite the patron of the underappreciated tonight, he said, glancing her way. The crowd chuckled, some amused, some condescending. Amara didn't respond. She simply took a sip of water, her paddle resting lightly between her fingers. From the back of the room, a tall man in a navy suit observed her with quiet interest. He wasn't whispering or mocking her like the others. He just watched the way one studies a puzzle they can't yet solve. His name was Charles Rowe, the event sponsor and the heir to one of the city's oldest art dynasties. He leaned toward his assistant. Find out who she is. The assistant nodded and quickly stepped out. Meanwhile, the man beside Amara, still clinging to his fragile ego, leaned over again. You know, it's rude to show off in circles like this. People might think you're trying to prove something. Amara's eyes met his. I'm not trying, she said evenly. I already did. He chuckled, pretending to be unbothered, but his grip on his glass betrayed him. So what's your story? You a collector? Or just playing dress-up for the night? Neither, she said. I'm a designer. A designer? He smirked. As in interior design? How charming. Amara's expression didn't change. As in architecture. I build things. He blinked. The mockery faltered for a split second before returning. Ah, you build things. How poetic. Before Amara could respond, the auctioneer lifted the next piece onto the stage. The murmurs quieted. It was the highlight of the night. Crown of Mirrors, a modern installation by a rising artist. The starting bid was $150,000. The crowd leaned forward, alert again. Do I hear 150? The auctioneer began. Hands shot up. 160. 170. 200. Amara remained still. The bidding climbed fast, 250, then 300. Charles Rowe, from the back, raised his paddle. 320. The auctioneer grinned. We have 320 from Mr. Rowe. Anyone for 340? Silence. Then softly, calmly, Amara raised her paddle. 350. The room turned. It was as if the air had been punched out of it. Charles's brow lifted. 370. Amara didn't hesitate. 400. Now the murmurs weren't whispers. They were waves. Who is this woman? She can't possibly afford that. She's bluffing. Charles smiled faintly. 450. Amara's hand rose again. 500. The auctioneer's voice shook slightly. "We have $500,000 from Ms. Blake." The man beside her leaned closer, whispering sharply, "You're out of your depth. You'll bankrupt yourself in front of everyone." Amara didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the stage. "You're assuming I have something left to lose." Charles studied her now with a new kind of respect. He set his paddle down. "Sold," the auctioneer declared. "To Ms. Blake for $500,000. Applause rippled through the hall, hesitant, unsure if they were clapping for her or her audacity. The man next to her sat speechless, his smirk gone. Amara simply leaned back, calm and composed, as the attendants wheeled the art away. That's when the assistant returned to Charles and handed him a small folder. He opened it, read the page, and froze for a moment. Then, a smile curved across his face, slow and knowing. He whispered, "So that's who you are." The night went on, but something had shifted. The laughter around Amara had turned into silence, and the silence had turned into unease. Every person who had mocked her earlier now watched her with thinly veiled curiosity, or fear. When the final gavel fell, the auctioneer stood to thank the attendees. "And before we conclude," he said, "a special note. All pieces purchased tonight will be temporarily displayed in the Westbridge Gallery before delivery to their new owners." At that, Amara rose from her seat, her voice soft but firm. "Actually, that won't be necessary." Every head turned. She reached into her bag and handed a document to one of the attendants. "Effective this evening, I've finalized a private agreement. The gallery and its assets, including all unsold art, now belong to me." The room froze. Even the auctioneer's voice faltered. I beg your pardon?" Amara smiled faintly. "I bought the gallery." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then chaos, gasps, whispers, disbelief. The same people who had refused to serve her an hour ago were now sitting in a building she owned. She turned slightly, meeting Charles Rowe's eyes across the room. He didn't look angry, just impressed. He gave a subtle nod, acknowledging her quiet victory. And as Amara walked down the aisle toward the exit, every head turned to follow her. The whispers that had mocked her earlier now carried only one question. Who is she really? The crowd hadn't moved since Amara's words dropped like a thunderclap. She had just announced that she bought the gallery, the very building they were standing in, and no one knew what to say. The auctioneer's gavel hung midair. The chandeliers sparkled above them, but even they seemed to tremble under the weight of silence. Amara's phone buzzed quietly in her bag. A single notification flashed. Transfer complete. Westbridge Gallery Holdings. She didn't even look at it. She already knew what it said. The same men who had laughed at her an hour ago were now adjusting their cufflinks, trying to mask their unease. The women who had whispered about her dress were suddenly quiet, pretending to study the artwork as if that could make them invisible. Charles Rowe, still seated near the back, didn't take his eyes off her. He leaned slightly forward, fingers steepled, curiosity replacing amusement. Amara finally broke the silence. "Mr. Langford," she said to the auctioneer, "please continue. I believe we still have items left on tonight's list." The man cleared his throat, visibly shaken. "Why yes, of course. Our next piece." But no one was listening. Half the audience was still processing the fact that the so-called nobody who had walked in through the front door in a plain dress now owned the very room they stood in. When the auction ended, most people rushed to leave, too embarrassed to face her, too proud to admit they'd been wrong. But Amara didn't move. She stood in front of the painting she'd bought earlier, The Widow's Garden. The brushstrokes seemed even more alive now, as if the artist's spirit had been waiting for this moment. She reached out, fingers hovering just above the canvas. "You finally have a home," she whispered. Behind her, a voice said quietly, "It's a beautiful piece." She turned. It was Charles Rowe. Up close, he looked older than she'd realized, silver hair, sharp blue eyes that had seen too many deals and too few truths. "Mr. Rowe," she greeted politely. He smiled faintly. "You've made quite an impression tonight, Miss Blake." "I didn't plan to," she said. "But I also didn't plan on being treated like a trespasser." He nodded, no defense in his eyes. "People see what they're comfortable seeing. Tonight, you made them uncomfortable." She tilted her head. "And you? Were you uncomfortable too?" Charles chuckled softly. "I was intrigued, mostly by your name." He pulled a small folder from his jacket, the one his assistant had given him earlier. "Blake Holdings. I should have remembered it sooner." Amara's expression didn't change. "Then you know." "Oh, I know," he said with quiet respect. "Blake Holdings is one of our city's largest private real estate investors. Which means, if I'm not mistaken, this auction house was sitting on your land long before you bought it." Amara gave a soft smile. "You finally caught up." He laughed once, shaking his head. "So this wasn't just a purchase. This was a reclaiming." She looked at the painting again. "Something like that." Charles took a deep breath. "You could have humiliated them, you know. You could have thrown out every single person who mocked you. Why didn't you?" Amara turned to him, her tone calm but unyielding. "Because people who live for applause are already punished enough when it stops." He studied her for a long moment, as though trying to memorize the look of integrity. A sight he didn't see often in that room. "You're not just buying art, Miss Blake. You're buying change. Change doesn't need to be bought," she said. "It just needs to be shown." A waiter approached timidly with 2 glasses of water. "Ms. Blake, Mr. Rowe? Would you like refreshments?" Charles took one, but Amara shook her head. "Thank you," she said softly, and the young waiter smiled, grateful, almost relieved that she had spoken to him like an equal. Charles noticed it. "You even thank the waitstaff. That's rare here." Amara's reply was simple. Respect costs less than wine, but it's served less often. They shared a quiet laugh, but there was a weight behind it, the kind of understanding that came from years of watching people mistake money for worth. Finally, Charles asked, "What will you do with the gallery now?" She turned to face him fully. "What it should have always done, represent everyone. Artists who were ignored because of their color, gender, or background. I want their work to hang beside the masters because they are masters too. The only difference is who got the spotlight." Charles smiled. "That's going to shake the board." "Then let it," Amara said. "Art isn't meant to make people comfortable. It's meant to make them look twice." Outside, the valet pulled up a car. Not a limousine, not a luxury SUV, just the same simple black sedan she had arrived in. As she stepped into the night air, camera flashes began popping near the entrance. Someone had leaked the story already. Unknown woman buys the Westbridge Gallery in stunning auction twist. Charles watched from the doorway as Amara walked toward her car. Her posture steady, her eyes calm. He couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years, the art world had found something, or rather, someone truly priceless. The grand chandelier flickered softly overhead as the shock began to settle. The Westbridge auction, the crown jewel of the city's art scene, had just been bought by the woman everyone had dismissed at the door. You could hear the disbelief in every corner of the room. Crystal glasses clinked nervously. Whispered conversations bounced off the marble columns like echoes of regret. Amara stood near the exit now, the newly signed ownership papers in her hand. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, the movements of someone who didn't need validation anymore. The auctioneer, visibly sweating beneath his perfect smile, approached hesitantly. "Ms. Blake, of course the papers appear in order. May I ask, what made you want to purchase the Westbridge Gallery?" Amara's gaze was steady. "Because it wasn't built to celebrate art. It was built to measure worth, and that's not art, Mr. Langford. That's arrogance." The crowd was still staring. Charles Rowe remained seated, expression unreadable, one hand resting on his cane. He looked like a man watching a storm he knew was long overdue. Finally, he stood. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "it appears we've all underestimated tonight's guest." He started walking toward her, the crowd parting instinctively. "Ms. Blake," he said, voice polite but curious, "I'm Charles Rowe. This gallery was founded by my grandfather." Amara extended her hand, firm, unapologetic. "I know who you are." He smiled faintly. "Then you probably know we don't often lose our holdings." Amara nodded once. "Then tonight must be a new experience for you." A few people laughed nervously, unsure if they were allowed to. Charles studied her, clearly impressed. "You didn't buy this place for profit, did you?" "No," she said softly. "I bought it for balance." He tilted his head. "Balance?" Amara gestured toward the artwork surrounding them. Rows upon rows of masterpieces, every wall echoing the same story. "Look around you, Mr. Rowe. Centuries of art, and only a handful from people of color, from women, from anyone outside your circles. You've built beauty on exclusion." The crowd fell utterly silent. Even the waiters had stopped moving. Charles sighed. "You sound like my daughter." "Then you should have listened to her," Amara replied evenly. He chuckled quietly, not in mockery, but in something closer to admiration. "You know, I can't even be angry. You played the game perfectly. You came in through the front door, and none of us saw the queen on the board until checkmate." Amara's expression softened just slightly. "I didn't come to play chess, Mr. Rowe. I came to clean the board." He nodded slowly. "And what happens now?" Amara looked toward the auctioneer, then at the audience, the same people who had whispered about her dress, her voice, her place. "Now," she said, "this gallery changes." Her tone carried through the hall like a quiet drumbeat. "From this day forward, every artist who has been rejected by Westbridge for not fitting its idea of worth will have a place here. Every overlooked painter, every unheard voice, every unseen face. Their work belongs on these walls." A young woman in the back gasped softly. An older man muttered something about ruining tradition. Amara turned toward him, her gaze calm. "Tradition built walls. I'm here to hang windows." Applause started softly, hesitant at first, then louder as people realized what had just happened. Some clapped out of respect, others out of shame. Charles Rowe raised his hand, quieting the room. "Ms. Blake," he said, "I'd like to make you an offer." "I'm listening," she said. He smiled. "I'll stay on as an advisor. Unpaid. You can fire half the board tomorrow if you like. But if you're going to rebuild this place, you'll need to know what not to repeat." Amara studied him for a long moment. "You mean you want to help me?" "I want to learn from you," he corrected. It was the first honest moment of humility the room had seen all night. Amara extended her hand again. "Then we'll begin tomorrow." They shook hands, the old world and the new finally meeting halfway. The cameras clicked. The journalists who had come to cover another elite art affair now had a very different story. A story about power, humility, and a woman who had rewritten the rules in one evening. As Amara turned toward the exit, one of the waiters she'd met earlier whispered, "Ms. Blake, you really own this place now?" She smiled. "No," she said softly. "I just made sure it finally belongs to the right people." And with that, she walked out into the daylight. No paparazzi, no applause chasing her. Just the quiet power of a woman who had reclaimed her dignity and handed it to everyone who had been denied theirs. Morning sunlight poured through the tall glass windows of the Westbridge Gallery. The chandeliers glistened like captured stars, and the marble floor reflected a new kind of brightness. Not from wealth, but from renewal. A week had passed since that unforgettable night, and the once exclusive auction house was now filled with faces it had never welcomed before. Artists from every corner of the city, painters, sculptors, photographers, stood side by side, watching their work being mounted on the same walls that once rejected them. The golden plaques beneath each piece bore new inscriptions. Westbridge Reimagined, curated by Amara Blake. In one corner, a little boy tugged his mother's sleeve, pointing at a painting of a woman in a simple cream dress, standing tall, surrounded by onlookers in tuxedos. The plaque read, "The Woman Who Bought the Silence" by Lydia Harper. It was the first artwork to be unveiled in Amara's new collection. As she stood watching from the balcony, Amara couldn't help but smile. She didn't crave applause, but the quiet hum of awe filling the gallery felt different this time. Sincere, not staged. Downstairs, Charles Rowe approached her, a cane in one hand and a faint smile on his lips. "You did it," he said. "You actually did it." She turned to him, her tone light but resolute. "It's not done yet. Change isn't one night's work, Mr. Rowe. It's a promise you keep showing up for." He nodded, looking around at the new energy pulsing through the building. "You know, my grandfather would have hated this." Amara chuckled softly. "Then I must be doing it right." Charles laughed, the sound full of something warm, admiration, maybe even relief. "You remind me of my daughter," he said. "She fought to get women into the academy. Everyone mocked her too, but she never stopped fighting." Amara looked at him kindly. "Then I suppose we're both continuing someone's unfinished story." Just then, the auctioneer, Mr. Langford, the same man who had mocked her subtlety with false politeness, approached nervously. His voice shook as he spoke. "Ms. Blake, I wanted to thank you for allowing me to stay on staff." Amara smiled faintly. "I don't fire people for mistakes, Mr. Langford. I just make sure they see them." He lowered his head in gratitude. "I do. I see it now." As he walked away, Charles leaned toward her. "You could have destroyed him, all of them, yet you didn't." Amara's gaze followed the man. "Destruction is easy," she said softly. "Transformation takes power." They both turned as cameras began to flash. The media had arrived. Reporters, photographers, even art critics who had once dismissed her name as irrelevant. They weren't there for gossip this time. They were there for history. A young journalist stepped forward, microphone trembling slightly. "Ms. Blake," she began, "how does it feel, taking ownership of a place that once refused to serve you?" Amara paused before answering. The room had quieted, everyone waiting. "It feels," she said finally, "like justice in color, like finally painting over a canvas that was left half empty for too long." Applause erupted, but not the polite, rehearsed kind. It was thunderous, emotional, genuine. Artists clapped, guests clapped, even Charles joined in. But Amara didn't bask in it. She simply turned and looked up at the massive skylight above her. Sunlight streaming in like gold poured from heaven. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. This place was never about the art hanging on the walls. It was about the people who weren't allowed to hang theirs. Her assistant approached, handing her a folder. "Ms. Blake, these are the next 5 acquisitions for your upcoming exhibit. All local, first-time artists." Amara smiled. "Good. Let's make sure they get the same stage everyone else had, without the price of humiliation." As she walked toward the press podium, Charles stopped her. "Ms. Blake," he said, his voice soft but meaningful. "You didn't just buy a gallery, you bought a revolution." Amara looked back at him with that same calm grace that had silenced a room full of arrogance a week before. "No," she said. "I just reminded them who art really belongs to." She stepped onto the stage, the crowd rising to their feet. Cameras flashed, lights reflected, and for one perfect moment, the woman they had ignored, mocked, and doubted stood exactly where she was always meant to be. Not seeking approval, but giving permission for others to rise. As the applause swelled, the painting The Widow's Garden caught the light behind her. Its colors brighter now, alive again. And on the lower edge of the frame, a new plaque had been added. Her words engraved in gold. "They refused to serve me once, So I built a table big enough for everyone. The crowd went silent, reading it. And in that silence, rich, powerful, endless, the woman who had once been overlooked became the masterpiece herself.